This is the MacBook Air M2 with 24 gigabytes of memory all maxed out. We're going to compare this machine performance with a 13-inch MacBook Pro M2 with 24 gigabytes of memory as well and see how they perform against each other, active versus passive cooling. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. A big thank you to those of you who have already subscribed. I greatly appreciate it. If you're new to the channel, welcome, and if you have not subscribed yet, please consider doing so. This way I can produce more content like this, and also hitting on the like button definitely helps with YouTube algorithm as well. This being said, I will be sharing with you a lot of information, so please feel free to pause at the chart so you can analyze the result yourself. Now let's have a look at our test system. The predominant one that we're going to be comparing are two M2. One of them is going to be the MacBook Air, the other one is going to be a 13-inch MacBook Pro, and both of them will have 24 gigabytes of memory. In addition to this, there are some variation in SSD. For example, the MacBook Air have 512 gigabytes, whereas the MacBook Pro have 256. But you're going to find that in the test that we're running specifically for what we're doing right now, it doesn't really make that big of a difference at all regarding the SSD speed or the SSD size on these machines, especially now that you have reached 24 gigabytes of memory. In addition to this, I'll be including results from the 13-inch MacBook Pro M2 in a variety of configuration. For example, the 8 gigabytes of memory in both the 256 and 512 gigabytes, which there are some performance variation, and I also made multiple videos about that. I'll leave a link to them in the description below so you can check those out. In addition to this, I will also be including the result from the base M2 MacBook Air as well to see how this compares with all these other machines in the lineup. And I'll also include the result from two M1 machine, that is the Mac Mini with 16 gigabytes and also the base MacBook Air with 8 gigabytes of memory, so we can see how the M1 and M2 are spreading out in terms of performance. The other thing too that I want to cover is data extrapolation. Many of you have been asking a question about specific machine configuration, especially with regards to memory. And one of the machines I don't have in the studio to test is a MacBook Air M2 with 16 gigabytes of memory, but there are certain charts in here that will give you a pretty good idea as to how the 16 gigabyte model would perform, and I'm going to share that with you when we get to those charts. Essentially, what you're going to do is take the result from a M2 13-inch MacBook Pro, the one that has a fan on the inside, make it a little bit longer, and the way how they're scaling between the Pro and the Air is going to be very similar with the 16-inch as well, just that it has more memory. I'm also going to be testing out the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro. That is going to be the super base model, the base configuration that Apple has to offer against an updated MacBook Air M2 with 24 gigabytes of memory, and we're going to see how that machine performs against each other. I think that's going to be a very great video that I definitely look forward to, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit on the bell for that. And with this, I won't be including any result from the Intel machine. However, you want to see how the variety of M1 chip does against an Intel, for example, 28 core Mac Pro. I'll leave a link to it up here and also in the description below. You can check that video out. Next up, before we go to anything else, I want to quickly talk about chip segmentation, and Apple really knows what they're doing. Remember that when you're getting these M1, M2 chip, these are more the consumer-leaning chip. So they are the compact family sedan. Can you use it to haul cargo? Yes, to a certain extent, but you're going to reach the upper limit to it very easily. If you're constantly using these cars to haul heavy cargo all the time, you're going to damage either suspension, the transmission, or something like that. Granted, you won't necessarily be damaging these machines, it would just take longer to run the task. So really think about your workflow, what you need out of this, and if you're working with these machines for revenue, for example, I am a pro photographer, I'm photographing for revenue, you may want to consider getting the Pro machine because it is that much faster and it's really meant for a much heavier workload. And that would be, for example, the M1 Pro, M1 Max, or the M1 Ultra chip. And these are things that are important to think about. One of the things that we can do is use the money resource that we have to buy time, and the way how we can buy time in these computers is to pretty much get a machine that is faster, and we can use that money in exchange for time. Just a thought to think about. I'm not encouraging anyone to upgrade to anything more than they really need, but if you're really doing this for revenue, I would definitely consider more of the pro-oriented chip for that. This being said, we're still looking at a lack of optimized app with M2, and it's probably going to be like this until the next iteration or the next cycle when the app developers caught up and upgrade all of this. Mind you that in the next few months, we're also going to have a new operating system as well. So the developer is going to have to catch up to the new chip and also the new operating system, which is kind of like a double whammy for them in some aspects. So that may not come as soon as we think. Just remember that too. And one more thing I want to add here is that all the approach I'm using is from a pro photographer perspective. This is why I'm taking a 45 megapixel RAW file and throwing it into these machines. Granted, I am an event wedding shooter, so chances are most of the time I go through more than 1,000 files, but this gives us a pretty good baseline for testing. So if you're wondering what pro workflow I'm referring to mine, and also doing a lot of these 4K video edits for YouTube to share content like this with you guys as well. Although video is a lot lighter with regards to system resources that it requires compared to photography, for example, using Lightroom Classic. Multitasking. So if you're looking for multitasking, none of these tests will include that. And if I have time, I'll do multitasking tests. But the way how I have put multitasking is this, and I made a video about that you can see the result doesn't really change too much. And with multitasking, it doesn't really show me how the silicon is performing with all these different apps. And what I really want to know is how the silicon is performing between one generation to the next, and not necessarily if we're going to throw everything into the mix and see how the machine would perform. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the other thing is that if you have a base model machine, all of us now have smartphones, right? So if you need to watch a video while your computer is doing the heavy task of exporting, rendering, whatever that may be, well, just take your phone out, watch YouTube or play TikTok or go on Instagram on here, and just leave your machine to run the task. This way it can run that specific task only, doing it much faster. This way it will be done. You can then use your computer to do whatever else you want to do without having to lag or slow down. So just something to think about in that regards too, that sometimes logic does make a lot of sense when we approach it that way and just let it finish the task first. SSD speed and size for majority, and I would say majority, when I say this, I mean 95+% of users, you're not going to have a problem. For the 5% of users that may run in an issue where it's a lot of swapping, well, chances are you're going to upgrade the system already anyway. But anyway, these are the speed between the different machine and the different SSD size. I'm not going to go over this that much more, but in essence, SSD, what it really comes down to, and even if you're getting an external one, for the daily use for Lightroom Classic, for any video workflow, I would say anything that can go up to around 500 megabytes per second is more than enough. I'll leave a link to this specific video I'm sharing up here and also in the description below. You can watch that. There's a lot of charts and it will explain everything you need to know about SSD speed and how it doesn't really affect the daily grind of just being a creator pro at all. Now let's have a look at Lightroom Classic. For this, I've ran all the tests in 11.4.1, running on macOS 12.4. And these are exported with GPU export enable. So let's have a look at the preview one-to-one comparing the 24GB machine, M2 MacBook Pro, 13-inch, and also the MacBook Air M2. You can see right now that active versus passive cooling. This is pretty much as what we would expect. Nothing surprising here. Here's the result comparing this between the MacBook Pro and also the MacBook Air. All these are M2 machines, but you can see a couple of things right now is that the way how, for instance, the 8GB is scaling, the 24GB would scale in a very similar fashion. And what's somewhat disappointing to me in this specific graph right now is the fact that the 24GB one is lagging behind the 8GB, but it's lagging in the exact same way between the Pro and the Air. But this is what I was telling you earlier about data extrapolation, that you can take a look at this and get a pretty good idea for how the 16GB model would perform. All right, so let's take a look at this comparing with all the other machines in the lineup. For example, the 16GB machine that I was referring to is sitting right up there at the very top. For some reason, I ran this test multiple times to generate a preview, and the 16GB just jumped right to the very top. I mean, it wasted literally no time at all, where the 8GB is slower, and amazingly enough, the 24GB is even taking longer. A lot of this I really attributed to the optimization. So once Lightroom Classic has been optimized for this, I think we're going to see a much better result. Let's have a look at export. This is using GPU for exporting in addition to the CPU as well. So I have gone in and verified that it is enabled. And I'll also leave a link in the description below too if you want to go in and verify if it's enabled or how to manually enable GPU acceleration on exporting, particularly with the 8GB machine, because that's not enabled by default. All right, seeing the result. Active cooling, passive cooling, you get this pretty good idea right now. They are scaling in a way how we would expect them to. When we compare this to the other machine, we can see that the 24GB machine between the Pro and the Air is scaling that way, and pretty much it's very similar on the 8GB machine too. It's just that it takes longer. So that's what I was saying earlier about data extrapolation. Take the bar chart from the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro, stretch it a little bit longer, that's going to be a result for the Air, and this is pretty much as we would have expected it to be. And lastly, amazingly enough, in this chart, something interesting does come out where the Mac Mini didn't pop out in the other chart as the top. However, on this one, it is really coming up there to the very top. And this has a lot to do with, again, optimization. Lightroom Classic is already, at this point, I would say, fully optimized for M1, so it can really go in and target those resources on the system really well. This is the way how the MacBook Pro is performing between the 24, 16, and 8GB. You can see the scaling. The scale will be very similar for the M2 MacBook Air, just going to be a little bit longer. Let's take a look at HDR Merge. Timing on this is going to be very similar to each other at 36 seconds. And when we throw in other machine into the mix, you can see that the 8GB one does take slightly bit longer by probably around like 5 seconds or so. Not a big deal, but you get the idea. And between the Pro and the Air, performance is about the same. Throwing all the other machine into the mix, you get a pretty good idea as to the performance spread. And I think that this test is really going to utilize a lot of memory on the system. So this is the Panorama Merge, taking 14 36 megapixel files, merging it into a 314 megapixel DNG. The result is that the MacBook Pro performed faster, as we would have expected, because it does have active cooling in the system. So this is definitely helping out with the performance of the machine overall, although the time difference is really not that big at all. It's just mere seconds, and in the single digit for that matter. And when we compare this, you can see clearly that the way how they're scaling are very similar between the 24 and also the 8GB machine. So as I said before, take the chart, make it longer, and now you have the result from, the Air counterpart to the MacBook Pro. With this in mind, I also have this M2 13-inch with 16GB. You can see it's performing there. So probably, I would say that if we have an Air 16GB one, it'll probably be a little bit longer, somewhere around there. This just makes a lot of sense when we take a look at the chart this way. Now let's take a look at Lightroom. This is a cloud version running on version 5.4, macOS 12.4. So with this in mind, we can take a look at the result right now. Active cooling is faster. This is again something that we would expect, although the time variation between these two is only a few minutes, and I don't think that it's that big of a deal at all. Now let's have a look at the result comparing this with the 8GB model. You can see clearly that the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro with 8GB sits at the very top while the Air sits at the very bottom. So the scaling on this one is really quite skewed, but a lot of this have to do with the lack of optimization for the M2. So you're going to see a lot of these happening. There are very few charts that's going to really follow the traditional norm, the way how we would expect them to perform. So this is a spread between all the other computers, and you can feel free to pause the video on this one. And now let's have a look at the result from Capture One version 15.3. This is Capture One 22 running on macOS 12.4. The import time using just the CPU between these two machines are pretty much almost identical, 12 seconds apart. There's really not that much variation, but then Capture One is not necessarily the program that you want to be looking at for machine performance anyway. You just want to see the relative performance between each different machine. It's not really optimizing the system really well at all. Here it is when we're comparing this to the 8GB model. For example, the Pro, you can see that the 8GB model and the 24 is performing that way. And when we take a look at the 24 Air, it's pretty much clustering in really close, whereas the 8GB Air is taking a slight touch longer. I mean, it's not that big of a difference, if you ask me. Here's the result comparing this with all the other machines. And we're going to take a look at the Capture One 22 export result. So for this, the export is using the GPU in the system, and both of these have the full GPU, so they're not like the trimmed down chip or anything like that at all. And we can see that there are some time difference between the two. I would say it's only a few minutes. It's not as significant where you're talking about 5 or 10 minutes variation or anything like that. What this is telling us is that even though we are loading the chip up, between passive and active cooling, it does a pretty good job, holding its own, even though it may be slightly slower. Comparing this to the 8GB machine, and the reason why I have organized this a little bit differently is not from fastest to slowest, but I have grouped this by the Pro and the Air, and you can also see that this is the Pro and the Air with 8 gigabytes, is to show you the relative performance between these two. And this is something that we can easily see and extrapolate, and something that we can expect. So with the 24, we get a pretty good idea. That's where it's supposed to be. Amazingly enough, the 8 gigabyte Pro is doing really well, and the 8 gigabyte Air is lagging and is taking a little bit longer than the 24 gigabyte Air. And for this one, we're talking about getting close into the 5-minute territory already. So there is some significant difference when you do add a little bit more RAM into the system for this to work. Here it is, the result comparing with the other machines, so you have a good idea of how the M1 and M2 are performing against each other. And we can see clearly that the M1 Mac Mini and the M1 Air is falling pretty much almost dead last in this chart. So this tells you that, you know, Capture One does definitely love the GPU, and the GPU on the M2 is definitely an improvement over the M1. All right, let's take a look at the result from Photoshop, and for this I am using Lloyd Chamber Digital Lloyd Test, and the reason why I use this test is because it reports the result, the scripts are good, and they're really based on a lot of real-world things that you can do in Photoshop, and I look at the script and I like it. So we're going to do these 3 tests from his, and I'll leave a link to his website in the description below too. So for this, let's take a look at Photoshop speed, and for this I'm testing 70 and also 90% RAM allocation. Pretty much what we would expect. The active cooling is performing slightly faster, but we're talking about milliseconds. I mean, technically, if you round these all up, they are literally about the same. Comparing this with the other machine, the 8 gigabyte one, well, with 70% RAM tends to take a little bit longer on the Air, but otherwise, I mean, you can see the way how these are clustering up. They're performing really close to each other. And with this, here's the result from all the other M1 and M2 machines, so you get a pretty good idea for Photoshop speed tests. And this is really mostly using the CPU on the system to run these tasks. Now let's take a look at Photoshop Medium. Having 24 gigabytes of memory, working with large files like this is going to show a difference. So we can see that the MacBook Pro is doing a lot better at 70%. However, when we start to bump up the RAM allocation to 90%, the variation between these two is getting that much smaller. I mean, you're talking about half a second faster, which is not that big of a difference at all. Now, one thing that you have to remember though is that Photoshop in general, if you're working with large files, it loves the RAM. It doesn't really go in and, you know, hit the CPU or the GPU or anything that hard at all. So pretty much what we are looking at here is just the way how Photoshop is going in to utilize the RAM on the system and also some of the CPU performance as well, but they're really close to each other. Here's the result comparing with the 8 gigabyte machine. You can see that 8 gigabyte takes much longer, so if you work with large files, giving yourself much more memory, it's going to be of a big benefit. Here's the result comparing with the other M2 and also M1 machines, so you have a good idea for the performance spread. And with this in mind, let's take a look at Photoshop Huge, which not many of you are going to be working with this type of large files. However, I know some that reach out to me like saying, thank you for doing this. These are exactly what I do. So I just want to show you the result here. Timing between these two, 4 seconds apart, really close to each other at 90% RAM allocation. When we add the 8 gigabytes in, you can see very clearly that if you're constantly working with large files, definitely consider upgrading RAM because you're saving a lot of time, and all these time you're saving will compound in the future. So if you're working on 10 of these files, well, multiply these 2-minute variation by 10, and now you have like 20 minutes of time that you're saving. Adding this over the lifespan of the machine is definitely going to be worth it. Here's the result comparing with the M2 and M1, so you have a pretty good idea for those spreads. Now let's have a look at Final Cut Pro, and this is the last one we're going to be looking at. So H.2 64 export is pretty much identical between these 24 gigabyte machine. When we add in the 8 gigabyte one, this is using the media encoder decoder engine. So it's performing pretty much about the same with only a few seconds apart, and this is what we would have expected it would do. So not that big of a difference there. How about HEVC 8-bit? Timing is about a second apart. Comparing to the other machine, only about a few seconds apart from each other. And when we compare this to the rest of the chart, they are performing as we would have expected because they all have the same encoder decoder engine in these machines, so there's not that big of variation. Now, one thing that I will point out is that the M1 machine, the Mac Mini and the Air, even though it is dead last on the chart, I mean, you're talking about maybe 20 seconds against the faster ones. So if these are all the tasks that you're doing, these M1 machine are still definitely one to consider. I mean, just take a look at the base model. I mean, that's doing really well on the Air one. That's pretty impressive. So let's have a look at ProRes. On ProRes one, because this is now requiring a lot more resources on the system. In addition to the media encoder decoder engine, it's also using a CPU and the GPU as well to render all these clips together, and having active cooling does help, but not really by much. We're only talking about a 10-second variation. When we take a look at this compared to the 8GB machine, well, ProRes are very large files. For example, this 10-minute clip is producing about a 35GB file in the end. And this is where having more RAM in the system is of a huge benefit. So if you're doing something like this, then consider getting more memory in the system. And you can see how these all spread out right now. Interestingly enough, the Mac Mini M1 is still holding its own just fine against all the other like 8GB machine in the lineup, which I find very impressive. It's only until you bump up, for example, the M2 to 16GB that it's really starting to beat out the Mac Mini M1 or the M1 machine in general. And as far as the Air with 8GB, this is pretty much dead last, but that's kind of what we would expect from these machines. Now, this is not including the result from any Intel machine, but if we do it, Intel would definitely fall dead last on any of these tests. I can tell you that much. All right, so what does all of this really mean? Well, essentially what it really comes down to is that the paradigm of getting the computer is starting to change a little bit, where there's really no one size fit all. You really need to think about the type of workflow that you do. And if you're currently using a Mac right now, one of the best things that you can do is download a program. For example, iStat Menu would be one of the ones that I use, and constantly just monitor the memory pressure. You can also use Activity Monitor to do that too. Before you go in and configure the machine, see where your memory pressure is at throughout, the time they're using a machine. If it's in the 50% range and it keeps going up higher into like the 60 and the 70, you probably want to get more RAM in the system. So those are the things to definitely consider on this one. So a few thoughts and recommendation I have. This is similar to the other videos I made as well, that if we go in and max out these M2 MacBook Pro or MacBook Air, that we're looking at a price that is within a striking distance of a base 14-inch MacBook Pro that has a more robust M1 Pro chip and also a Liquid Retina XDR display. That is the mini LED one, more ports on the system. So it really depends on what you really need. But I think that doing a comparison between these machines, for example, the MacBook Pro all max out against a base 14-inch and also the MacBook Air max out against a base 14-inch one, it's going to be very interesting. So stay tuned for that. Now, let's just really quickly wrap up the 24GB of memory on, for instance, the MacBook Air. Is it worth it? I think that if your workload demands a lot and you want to have a light machine that has passive cooling, no sound whatsoever, and you just love the design of a new MacBook Air, it's definitely something to consider. And you can see right now that the M2 chip from all these tests that I'm doing is holding its own just fine, even though it's in a passive cooling state for all the tasks that we're doing right now. And this is really pushing the machine hard, where it's really heating up the chip, because we're literally having the chip process and render out raw files, 1,000 of them at a time, and you're really only still talking about a variation between only a few minutes on a active cooling and a passive cooling machine. So these are things to think about. Anyway, I hope that you find this video helpful. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Just remember to be kind about it. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit on the bell if you're new, and in Art we trust.